All right, I think we can start. And my name is Taras Gagaluk. I represent the Leibniz Institute of Agricultural Development in Transition Economies, IAMO. Now I would like to invite the director of IAMO, Professor Alfons Ballmann, to give a welcome address.
Yeah, many thanks, Taras. Welcome everybody to our webinar today. The topic agriculture amidst the war in Ukraine. Please be aware that we record this presentation and webinar so that it can be published afterwards. Yeah, this webinar is part of a joint series of online panel discussions on the war in Ukraine, which is jointly organized by the Kiev School of Economics, the German-Ukrainian Agricultural Policy Dialogue, Wageningen University and Research, and IAMO. Before I go into some further details of the motivation, let me thank particularly the main organizers of this seminar today. These are Maria Bogonos from Kiev School of Economics, Willy Myers from Missouri, and Taras Gagayuk from IAMO. If we look a couple of years back, and look at figures of exports and wheat and corn of Russia and Ukraine, these figures look very different from those of some 15 years ago. So the case that we have currently big debates and concerns that because of the war, there is huge problem with food security on the international markets, then this is a recent development because Ukraine and Russia became big exporters, particularly of wheat and corn. I remember some 15 years ago, I had quite some discussions with our today's moderator, Stefan von Kamon, where we wondered whether, for example, Ukraine would ever become again a breadbasket of Europe. And the question is, okay, why? And one reason is that these countries indeed more or less doubled or even partly tripled their total production. And that is mainly driven by increasing yields. If we look, for example, at yield figures of Ukraine and Russia for corn, we see that these figures doubled over the past 20 years. And for wheat, the yields increased also by some 50%. And there is surely huge further potential. And the question is, why? What are the determinants of this progress? And there are a number of reasons. One is surely an intensification, much higher fertilizer use than some 20 years ago. There's partly an adaptation to climate change. So, for example, Ukraine is now producing lots of corn. There were huge investments in technology, which started some 15 years ago with food crisis in 2008. There was an increasing liquidity because of better access to finance and an increasing equity of the companies. There was a digitalization in recent years, which eventually led to a kind of double benefit. On the one hand, the companies benefited from precision farming, but on the other hand, digitalization allowed to enforce compliance so that theft is no longer a big problem on many farms. Also, there was a change in management and culture, and eventually also because there were some leading farms which invested in technologies, there were spillover effects. And surely a key question regarding what means the war now is that we are dealing with, let's say, a young booming sector, and that we always have to be aware that the huge importance of this country, of these countries nowadays are an effect of recent changes and developments. And the question is, for example, how resilient are the agricultural sectors in these countries given the shocks which are now created. Here I would like to thank for your attention, and I wish you an interesting webinar. I hope you can learn something and that there are opportunities to discuss the key issues. And herewith I would like to hand over to Stefan von Kramon, who will moderate the webinar today.
Yes, thank you very much, Alphonse. And thank you very much to the organizers at YAMO and the Kiev School of Economics and Willie Myers for putting this together today. I'm really looking forward to it. Today's panel discussion on agriculture amid the war in Ukraine. My name is Stefan von Kramon. I'm professor of agricultural policy at the University of Göttingen, and I'm going to do my best to lead you through this in the next 90 minutes or so. Sometimes at the beginning of an event like this today, the moderator has to try to sort of whip up interest and convince the audience that the topic is important, but that's clearly not the case today. The repercussions of Russia's attempted invasion of Ukraine, not only for agriculture, but certainly also for agriculture, are so far-reaching and manifest that an event like this is an easy sell. Before I go on, I'd like to stress one thing. We're going to talk about markets and logistics and about prices and tons and so on, but underlying all of this is terror and tragedy that's taking place in the middle of Europe as we speak, triggered by a deluded and brutal dictator in Moscow. I have many friends and acquaintances in Ukraine dating back to the 1990s and 2000s when I visited the country over 50 times as a policy advisor for the German government. And the recent events are shocking, and words cannot convey the sadness that I feel. And I'm sure many who are listening in today share that, and my admiration for the bravery of the people of Ukraine. It's not easy to move on from those sorts of thoughts to the topics that we will be discussing today, but the topics that we will discuss today are also very important. They also involve life and death, although at a remove, of course, from the terrible events that are going on in Ukraine at the moment. The war in Ukraine is affecting food security around the globe. It's affecting important debates such as those on food versus fuel and food versus feed, and more generally, the transformation of agriculture as a whole in the face of climate change and other environmental challenges. Joining us today to discuss these issues is an excellent panel of experts. Before I introduce them, I should reiterate, please, if you have questions in the course of the presentations, enter them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. We have asked each of the presenters to present for roughly 10 to 12 minutes altogether, and that will hopefully leave us enough time at the end for discussion in this session. Unfortunately, I must announce that one of the presenters, Stephanie Murphy from the Bayer AG, who was scheduled to join us today, has had to drop out on short notice for health reasons. So our best wishes for a speedy recovery. She will be missed, but we still have 4 very distinguished panel members with more than enough expertise and unique perspectives for an insightful and stimulating discussion. So let me start by giving the floor to Joe Glauber, who's a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington and a former chief economist at the USDA, US Department of Agriculture. From 2007 to 2009, Joe was the special Doha agricultural envoy at the Office of the US Trade Representative, where he served as the chief agricultural negotiator in the Doha talks. And his presentation today is entitled Implications of the War in Ukraine for Global Food Security. Joe, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great, Stefan. Thanks so much. And thanks to YAMO, and thanks to University of Kiev. I also, it's hard to do these presentations because we do quite rapidly get into the statistics and everything, and the amount of suffering and everything else that's ongoing right now in Ukraine. I think again, you said it best. And so, but what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to kind of go through why we're seeing markets prices so high right now. I think the previous speaker went through and just talked about the growth of Ukraine and Russia in terms of global trade for grain, for wheat, corn, barley, sunflower seeds, and other commodities. I think it's important to realize that even prior to, let's see if my screen is operating. Yeah, great. So even prior to this conflict starting, prices already were very, very high. We'd seen this big run up in prices starting about 6-12 months ago. And with grain prices getting up about as high as they were back in 2012-13 area. And at least in nominal terms, seeing this really big growth in prices. And that's across the board. I mean, largely all the grains except for rice have shown strong increases over the last 12 months. Vegetable oil prices at record highs. And that's due to a whole variety of reasons. We had small crops in North America last year for wheat, particularly in Canada and the northern plains of the US. We've had a very large drought in South America, which has affected global soybean production and exports coming out of Brazil in particular. And then the wheat crop also drought in the Mideast. And so all this has increased demand and has decreased supplies, and demand has been very strong as well. China's been buying a lot of feed grains. Ukraine has been a very important supplier for China. You also have things like biofuel production, which I think were mentioned in the previous by the previous speaker. These are all very important things that have been increasing demand at a time when we've had some supply shortfalls. So all that happened, of course, before Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine, and again, just the same. At IFRI, we do a quick calculation in terms of just caloric value of exports, and these two countries supply about 12% of the calories that are traded in the world. So very, very important. Again, depending on what years you're looking at, you get these market shares, but somewhere around 30% of the wheat coming out of the Black Sea. You have another 15 to 20% of corn, barley, very similar percentages, and 75% of sunflower oil. So all these things having very major impacts. And if we look at what the impacts are, particularly in the nearby countries who have switched, the chart that was shown showing the growth of wheat and corn production in the Black Sea, you can see that has also meant that a lot of these buyers have switched their suppliers. So Egypt, formerly 20 years ago, was buying a lot from the US, buying a lot from the EU, buying a lot from Australia in terms of wheat. Now that's changed dramatically. And we're going to talk a little about what those implications are. First, I think it's important to focus on wheat just because of one, it's a food grain, and so anytime you talk about a tight supply in food grains, that means people either have to substitute for other commodities that can supply them calories, or they're going to pay a lot more for the underlying prices for foods of what they're eating. And so when you look at an area like North Africa and the Middle East, you see the extreme dependence on wheat in terms of overall calories. A country like Egypt, about 35% of what they consume in terms of calories comes from bread or wheat products. And when you're talking about wheat, about 75% of that is, or 75% of that is imported. Most of those imports, as you can see from here, are coming from a large share from the Black Sea. And we just chose 3 countries here, but again, you can see the heavy dependence on the Black Sea for supplies around the world. And so, again, as I said, that they are important. Wheat is very important in terms of the overall share of caloric consumption. If you look at the import share, these are all large. So this key dependency on imports. And I of course, what we've seen is that prices have increased, 20, 25% for a lot of these commodities since the end of February. I mean, the first couple of weeks, we saw wheat prices actually go nearby contract futures markets go up 50, 70%. They've come down, but they're still running very, very high. There's most of the markets show high prices for at least the next 6 months, and even some softening over the next 12, 18 months, but still 18 months out, still above pre-February level or pre-March levels. So these are the markets certainly are expecting the adjustments to be very slow here. And I think that these are, again, I'm focusing on the Mideast here and North Africa, but it's important to realize that these are global prices. And so these same high wheat prices are being faced if you're someone in Indonesia trying to import wheat, and a country like Indonesia has imported a lot of wheat in the past from Ukraine. So these are all important, and again, raising prices for wheat around the world, depending, it doesn't matter whether it's coming from the Black Sea or the US or anywhere else. If you look at the timing of imports for a lot of these countries, you can see for these large importers, they're importing pretty much year round. And you can see a heavy reliance, when their own local harvests are coming in, sometimes that may be at a time when imports are less. But largely, again, you can see that the role of the Black Sea here is still very, very important, particularly for countries in North Africa and in the Middle East. And if just in terms of looking at what the additional costs of importing wheat means for these countries. Now, when you have really high prices, of course, demand typically falls, and that helps. High prices bring out additional supplies. They create disincentives to consume. So that's in part how markets will regulate themselves over time. But when you're talking about countries like these North African countries, where they are the demand tends to be highly inelastic, that is, very small changes in demand relative to prices, in part because the countries themselves subsidize the price of bread, and that's to keep prices low for consumers, so they don't create social unrest like what we saw in 2010, 11 with the Arab Spring, et cetera. But just looking at the cost of importing wheat, just looking at the price change in wheat since mid-2021, you can see that the numbers we're talking about are quite large, and particularly when you're talking about small, poor countries like Yemen, where that may be as much as 4% of the GDP. And so that in a country like Egypt, a large upper middle income country, they'll be able to a degree afford it. I mean, these aren't easy things to absorb by any country, but at least the wealthier countries, more with the greater GDPs, will be able to afford it. But a country like Yemen is going to be highly, highly dependent on humanitarian aid. And a country like Yemen imports about roughly almost 100% of its wheat needs. Okay, so I'm going to turn really quickly to sort of what can we expect in terms of recovery. So the big question I get asked a lot is, where are these wheat supplies come from? And I think it's really important to remember about the wheat market that 60% of it is planted in the Northern Hemisphere in the fall, harvested in the summer. So 60% of the crop is currently in the ground, is now emerging. We know that's a big problem in Ukraine in terms of whether or not that they can even harvest that crop or apply fertilizers. And this is a time of year when as that crop wheat is emerging out of dormancy, you would normally be applying fertilizers. I'm going to get into fertilizers in just a moment. Those costs are extremely high, but I think that it's important to realize that 60% of the crop, you aren't going to be able to really respond to these high prices until the fall. The other 20% is in the spring planted in the Northern Hemisphere. We just saw planting intentions from the US showing essentially no additional wheat acreage in terms of compared to last year. Canada, I expect we're going to see very, very similar results. That is, we don't expect big supply responses out of Canada, mainly because corn and maize and soybean prices are also so high, and fertilizer costs are high, and wheat is fairly nitrogen intensive. So additionally, the two other major countries are Russia and Kazakhstan. And then you turn to the Southern Hemisphere. And luckily, we had a very good crop out of Australia and Argentina this past winter, which was just making it to the market right now. We expect that they will be seeding shortly. And so hopefully we'll see good results there. I might add, in terms of looking at the overall crop productions, you can see that in the US at least, that yellow area means that there's a lot of dryness in the US right now, where a lot of that winter wheat crop is grown. In fact, the crop conditions report that came out on Monday from the US Department of Agriculture suggested about 36% of the wheat was in very poor condition. So that's all going to have to be watched very carefully. I'm going to turn just briefly to the energy markets, and then I'll be done. But just to say that Russia and here Belarus are important suppliers on the export market. This just shows you in terms of overall how important these various nitrogen, phosphates, and potassium-based fertilizer components are in the world, and how highly dependent they are on trade. And so you can see here in this map just how important Russia and Belarus are in terms of supplying nutrients to the rest of the world. And this obviously is going to be the point. This war is highly disruptive in terms of global markets on the food side, but also on the input side as well. And I think even focusing in just on an area like West Africa, you can see that something like potash, most of that comes from Russia and Belarus. And so when you're talking about what this war is doing, is it's creating, a lot of these countries are now scrambling to get those supplies, both in terms of food and fertilizer. And I'm sorry I'm out of time and I've gone over, so I'm going to stop right now, and hopefully we'll get a chance to come back and take questions or whatever. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That's great. Just two things that occurred to me as you were presenting. One is this idea that in a lot of interviews I've had with media in Germany, people are sort of concerned that, you know, countries that have imported a lot of wheat from Russia and Ukraine are in trouble, but the other countries aren't. And of course, It doesn't work that way. To us economists, it's obvious. But and the other thing, you know, last week I was hearing farmers groups in Europe calling for import subsidies for fertilizer. And that's the sort of reaction that would only exacerbate the sort of problems that you're talking about there.
Yeah, particularly for rich countries. I mean, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, we'll get back to some of that, I'm sure. The next speaker, thank you very much, Joe. The next speaker is Linda Gutz, and Linda is Deputy Head of the Agricultural Markets Division at IAMO, and she's published extensively on the development of agriculture and the food industry in Russia and the Black Sea region and its implications for global food security. Linda's presentation is on export restrictions and the possible role of Russia on agricultural markets. Linda, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Stefan, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Now, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so the title of my presentation is Export Restrictions and the Possible Role of Russia for Agricultural Markets. And I'd like to point out that that presentation has benefited a lot from my colleagues Miranda Svanidze and Tino Giactani. And I'd like to start with pointing out again the dominant position of Russia and Ukraine on world grain markets. Very roughly speaking, we can say Russia and Ukraine account for 1/3 of world wheat export supply and about 1/4 of the world barley export supply and about 1/5 of the world corn export supply. And here you see that the wheat exports are dominated by Russia, while the corn exports are dominated by Ukraine, and both countries have about the equal share in the barley exports. You clearly see that for both countries, grain exports have been growing substantially over time. And yeah, somehow building on Alphon's comment at the very beginning, I would also like to point out to one factor which has spurred that growth in grain exports of both countries, which really show a very rapid growth. You see here, for example, in red Russia, the wheat exports. Russia has still been a net importer in the year 2000, and it has grown up to the largest wheat exporter in the world within 17 years only. And yeah, a further factor which has spurred that process is the exchange rate development, which in Russia is very closely influenced with the development of the world oil price. But also in Ukraine, we see that the Ukrainian hryvnia has concurrently with the ruble exchange rate shown a very strong devaluation. And yeah, a very few years later, we really see that the exports have risen strongly. Here again, the world oil price in red, and in blue you see the ruble-dollar exchange rate. And up to 2014 in Russia, the ruble exchange rate was managed, while it was abolished during that oil price crisis where we saw that strong oil price decreases in the year 2014. And afterwards, yeah, that managed exchange rate regime was transformed to a free-floating exchange rate regime. You hear for Russia in the time period directly following the year 2014, you really see it's like a mirror. So the exchange rate and the oil price. So there's really a very strong influence of the oil price on exchange rate. In the very back, you see many different regional Russian domestic wheat prices, which typically partially show quite substantial price differences, which have to be attributed by the large distances which separate the main producing regions. Yeah, now the importance of agricultural trade with regard to Russia amounts to, in the last years, between 8 and 11% of Russia's total external trade, amounting to $37 billion in the year 2020, while much higher is the share of oil, gas, and coal, which amounts to between 43 and 54% in the last 3 years, with an amount of $142 billion in the year 2020. Regarding Russia's total agricultural exports, we see cereals and oilseeds are dominating, and both product groups together have a share of almost 60% in Russia's total agricultural exports. Yeah, very unique feature of Russia's grain policy or the wheat sector or wheat trade is that it really has a long and intensive history of restricting its wheat exports. And you see here, for example, in the year 2007-8, during the first global food price crisis, Russia implemented an export tax of up to 40%. And then during the food price crisis 2010-11, the whole export was banned. We also see some less dramatic tax implemented in the year 2015. And now, since the outbreak of Corona, there's really heavy interference and heavy restriction ongoing in grain markets, particularly wheat markets, of course, but also other products. So in the year 20, an export ban and export quota were implemented for wheat. And on top of that, in the year 2021, a floating export tax was also implemented, which still prevails. Yeah, let's take a look here on the export ban in the year 2010-11. You see in red, this is a spot market price of wheat in the port of Rouen in France, an FOB price. And in blue, this is a regional wheat market price in North Caucasus. And what is typical, or whenever you see that the export restrictions are well effective, as you see in the year during that 2010-11 food price crisis, the margin, the difference between these two prices is increasing. So what happens with the export restrictions is the domestic supply, of course, increases, and that brings down domestic prices, and thereby increasing its difference to the world market price. So yeah, so you see that the restrictions were very effective during 2010-11. But if you now look really in recent years, in the year 21 up to now, March 22, which you also see here in that graph, currently Russia's wheat trade is also heavily restricted by a floating export tax, and as some report, partially even restrictive. So it's expected that Russia really has carryovers because currently the tax is so high that yeah, it's not a lot cannot export profitably. Yeah, along with the export restrictions of Russia comes some restrictions with regard to the Eurasian Economic Union member countries. So Russia is a member of that union together with Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, and they do not apply the same wheat or grain export tax or restriction system, and therefore here and then Russia also bans its exports to those union countries. This is also the case currently. So currently Kazakhstan, for example, cannot import wheat from Russia, and probably one reason is that Kazakhstan, for example, was negotiating with Egypt if it could maybe take over some parts of Russia or Ukraine. And another point is that, of course, by exporting wheat via a third country, the aim would be to escape the export taxes. So by banning the exports to those EU member countries, Russia ensures that they will get these taxes. I would also like to give you some further results of our analysis on the wheat export ban of the year 2010-11. You see here on the very left side the intra-Russian wheat trade. So usually the Volga region exports wheat to North Caucasus, aiming that that wheat is exported via its ports to the world market. And you see those trade flows here in the graph in green. And these are this is not the complete trade, but this is the trade observed via rail with the wagons. And you see clearly in the year 2010-11, there was a trade reversal. So during the export ban, traders in North Caucasus instead exported their wheat to Volga, a region which was heavily affected by a drought. And we also analyzed price transmission and market integration and wanted to see if there's any effect of the export ban on the integration of the markets within Russia. And in the upper figure, you see clearly that during that export ban, the integration of domestic markets strongly increased. Here with a long-run price transmission elasticity increasing from 0.43 to 0.67 on average during the export ban. And we also see that afterwards, after the ban was removed, the integration again loosened a bit. We explain this, the increase in market integration by the increase in domestic trade flows. So without a ban, more wheat is exported to world market, but during that ban period, a lot of trade was ongoing within the country, somehow cushioning the price increases in the regions which were heavily affected by the drought, as for example, the Volga region. Another effect we could identify is that during the ban period, the transport costs, the transaction costs increased, which we measured by threshold, within a threshold price transmission model. Here in that example, our median value of transaction costs doubled during the ban, but it came down again afterwards. Also, the variance remained pretty high. And this is, so we explain this by the increase in transaction costs. We explain that in that situation, new trade partners have to be identified and a lot has to be changed. And that, of course, involves a lot of additional transaction costs, which is reflected here in that increase in thresholds. Now here at IAMO, we have done a couple of studies investigating the export restrictions, not only in Russia, also in Ukraine and Serbia. And let me draw some very general conclusions now regarding export restrictions in Russia on wheat. Always, the Russian government puts as its official aim to dampen domestic bread price inflation. But however, the efficiency is low simply because the costs of wheat have only a very low share of about 10% in the total bread production costs. And therefore, even if you dampen a little bit the wheat price, it does not substantiate in a strong price dampening effects of bread, of course. However, what it dampens is domestic grain prices. We have clearly seen that in the figures. And this is less beneficial for consumers, but rather for the livestock producers. And potentially, since the feed costs are quite high for meat production, could benefit consumers by reducing meat prices, but only could. Given this empirics of the export restrictions, we can conclude that wheat export restrictions are bad for grain producers and exporters. They lose because they cannot benefit from the high world market prices, while it's the meat producers which benefit. And if consumers benefit, that of course is highly questionable. In the long run, we clearly see a negative effect of export restrictions, and they hamper the domestic market development. Now, given what we have observed, so that Russia so far has used export restrictions exclusively with the aim to achieve some domestic goals. Now the question is if, or what is the effect, or what does it imply? What does it mean if Russia might weaponize its export restrictions as we find it currently increasingly discussed in the public. So let me simply explain what it means, because since we of course cannot know how the Russian government will decide, but we can summarize 3 points. First of all, if Russia would, for example, now upcoming harvest in July, August, restrict its exports strongly, that would be beneficial to the other grain export countries. The countries which are, or most of them, or many of them, classified by the Russian government as the unfriendly countries, which you see in that figure above. In those countries, or the farmers and the exporters in those countries would benefit economically from enhanced export opportunities, and of course, very high prices, which we would expect in this case. On the other hand, as our second point, we would expect that food security in the strongly import-dependent countries, like Egypt, for example, which are mostly the friendly countries in terms of the Russian terminology, their food security will come at a risk. And that might even lead to political instability because we might see some riots. And the third issue, I would like to mention that in case Russia would weaponize its export restrictions in fall, it would, of course, itself experience economic losses. So the domestic grain export business could not benefit from the wheat export to the world market. Probably they could not store the wheat. They would have to just throw it away. And of course, that might have medium to long run effects, that the attractiveness for investments in that sector decreases and the further market development will be hampered. Now, what we actually currently see, and now I come to my second possible role for Russia on that on grain markets. Currently, actually, we see that Russia is inducing hunger in the world by using its military power to prevent that Ukraine can operate its grain exports. We have seen that Ukraine has for some time period lost control over all its Black Sea ports. Currently, important ports have reopened. However, exports have shrunk, and the transport costs, of course, have increased because parts of the exports now have to be operated via its western border, using also train transport. And that implies that the Ukrainian grain exports will lose competitiveness on world markets. Thinking a bit more far, that could imply that Russia's dominant position on the world grain market might strengthen in the short run, but also in the long run, given we all know that Russia bears large additional grain production capacities. Now let me come to some conclusions. Now, in order to stabilize the global grain trading system, in the short run, it's decisive that the functioning of the Russian grain production and export sector is maintained. And yeah, it's very nice to see that the EU currently is already providing inputs to farmers in Ukraine as fuel and seeds to ensure this. And also the EU has announced that they will ensure that Ukrainian traders will obtain access to EU ports so that their grain can be exported and also delivered to the heavily import-dependent countries, for example, in Africa. Another issue is, of course, that in the short run, we have to see how additional grain production capacities can be mobilized in other countries. So a lot of political economy process is already on its way. Of course, it's highly important to continue that Russia's agricultural trade is excluded from sanctions, and that indeed that is ongoing, that Russian grain is also exported. And now to my second conclusion regarding the long run development. That Ukrainian war now also again shows us that the resilience of the global grain trading system should be enhanced, and trade diversification could play here a really great role. However, we have to see if that might require that other grain producing countries beyond Russia and Ukraine, that they need to increase their engagement in grain exports to ensure this. And we need to review if domestic grain production in the grain import countries could be raised at acceptable conditions. Nonetheless, resilience of the food system is no free lunch, and we can expect that resilient food systems will also involve higher food prices. Yeah, I'm at the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Linda. That was great. Based on a wealth of experience that you've gathered. You mentioned the point about the weaponization, and that's something maybe we can get back to in the discussion. My concern is not so much that Russia is going to use grain as a weapon to favor individual countries based on their friendliness. My concern is that Russia is going to use the situation to destabilize governments that could, for example, lead to refugee flows to Europe, that the actual target will be the EU, because they know that we react very, very sensitively to refugee flows, and that could sort of weaken the solidarity that we've seen. But maybe we can get back to that. I heard a report this morning of 50,000 tons of Ukrainian wheat destined for South Africa via the port of Gdansk. These flows are working, but of course, they're very limited in what they can do compared to what would happen through the Black Sea. And that maybe takes us to our next speaker, Georg von Nolten, who completed a master's degree in agricultural economics in Göttingen in 2005. And since then, he's gathered extensive experience in managing and restructuring large-scale agricultural enterprises in Central and Eastern Europe, including the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Russia, and most recently, since 2018, specifically in Ukraine. And his presentation is entitled Ukraine Production and Export 2022 and Further. And I'm really looking forward to also hear sort of a more production-based, farming-based perspective on the issues. Georg, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to the panel today. It's a real pleasure. If you can say in the current circumstances, it's a pleasure to attend. It's also a pleasure to see Professor von Kramon again, exactly 20 years after I've been sitting in his agricultural policy lectures in Göttingen. So it's really nice to see roads crossing again. If I can give a very, very quick rundown, please, on the next slide on the company that I think I can say honored to run in these circumstances, because I'm extremely proud of the team that is working here. The company is called Continental Farmers Group. We are land bank wise the 6th largest operator in Ukraine, with about 191,000 hectares farmed. The key crops are the ones that have been touched upon exactly in the previous presentations as the crucial ones. If we look at global food security questions, we grow wheat, we grow barley, we grow oilseed rape, we grow sunflower, and that's something that I think is worth also touching upon. We've so far had a very wheat-focused discussion and maize-focused discussion. Ukraine is also with about 50% covering the global sunflower oil market, which is an important commodity. We grow maize, we grow soya, and we are, as a specialized niche product for the Ukrainian market, the largest potato grower in Ukraine. We run our own elevator and logistics facilities with more than 500,000 tons of grain storage facility and previously export logistics that were orientated down to the Black Sea ports. So our sales was usually on that CPT or FOB base Black Sea Ukrainian port till about or till exactly the 24th of February, and we have got 2,000 employees in the country. In terms of the location of the company, if I may draw your attention to the map on the right, and that's extremely important to realize the little purple circles on the western side of Ukraine. These are our operating areas. The various clusters, the organizational structure is 5 clusters that cover these 191,000 hectares. Our headquarters are also Western Ukraine based, which is a difference to all the other big holdings who usually have got head offices in Kiev. And I believe that this location is probably something that amongst the big players in Ukraine puts us in a bit of a different box in terms of our resilience of what is going on right now in Ukraine. You can clearly see the military actions. I've put in a map here on the 4th of April. We are all aware that Russian ground troops were further into the country than they were on the 4th of April, which you can see on the light yellow. As for our company, we haven't had any physical impacts, which is also important to know. We've had missile strikes in our area of operation. We continue to have them, but we don't have any assets or infrastructure impacted. So please keep that in mind for the rest of the presentation. And as a side note, towards the humanitarian side, apart from keeping the company running with the Standard Spring program, we are also at the moment heavily engaged in humanitarian aid, both refugees, but also sending humanitarian aid into the areas that are impacted by Russian ground troops. Let me jump to the next slide, please. And what we have done here internally, because one big dependency that we can see, and I think that's maybe not, it came out in the previous presentation by Linde. It didn't come out that much in the previous one, and that's actually the bottleneck that we see. It's probably not Ukraine's ability to produce, and I will come to that, which will be seriously hampered. But it's even worse. We're talking about serious limitation of export. And let me drive you through this logic. What we've done here is we've taken Ukraine and we split it basically internally for some statistic games into 3 regions. The dark purple on the west is the area that we are operating in, and many others are operating in. It's not impacted by military ground troops. It's not impacted by serious missile strikes in terms of damaging agricultural infrastructure. We've only seen missile strikes so far on strategic infrastructure. We've got the central region of Ukraine, which is more heavily impacted by missiles, which has had impacts on infrastructure, which has got serious logistics issues in terms of fuel availability right now. And then we've got the eastern and southern region, which is the regions that either were occupied by Russian troops or currently still are, which means the impacts on agricultural assets. I think we can all of us imagine it's the roads are wrecked, bridges are wrecked, so there is very little room for movement. A lot of the staff of these companies is gone, agricultural machinery is damaged, inputs are gone, fuel is gone. So what we've done is we've run a little simulation that simply took the average production of these various areas, these 3 areas, and run them through a model that assumed that the West would produce as normal, that the region 2, the central Ukrainian part, would see a drop that would be in the range of about 30%, and then the eastern and southern areas would see a drop in up to 70%. If we run these numbers with historical yields, please to the next slide, this would mean that after production levels from 2019, 20, 21, if we take the key crops, corn, wheat, sunflower, barley, soybeans, and oilseed rape, which have over the last 3 years, and we've seen how Ukraine picked up over the last 10, 15 years with production levels. We've seen for the last 3 years average production levels around, say, on average 90, 95 million tons of product on these crops. 2021 definitely was a bumper harvest, but it's also a harvest that was driven by Ukraine's ability to realize yield potential. If we run the assumptions that I've just told you about, then what we see is that the total production of Ukraine would drop to 56 million tons. If we then take off the internal use just based on historic 3-year averages and put on for some key crops, which is in our perception wheat, barley and maize, a food security element of only additional 10% compared to previous years, then we would end up with an exportable volume out of Ukraine of about 25 million tons of product, broken down by the various crops as stated below, which is, if we take the last year's averages, dropping to around about 40%, 45% of what Ukraine used to export over the last couple of years. That's in itself a fairly dramatic number. But I believe, and we believe here from the side of our company, that's not the end of the story. It's going to get even worse in terms of exportable volume, depending on where the situation with the Black Sea ports is going to go. If we can jump to the next slide, please. What we've done as a next step, and I'm happy to share for the ones who are interested, the breakdowns and the files later. But what we have done basically is we have said, if we take the Ukrainian Black Sea ports and assume they would all run on full throttle, that would mean an export capacity of about 92 million tons per year. We know by now that about 40% of this export capacity is under Russian occupation. We know that out of these 40%, 75% is actually damaged. We don't understand the degrees. We also understand, as mentioned before, that the other Black Sea ports that are not Russian occupied, this being Odessa and Chernomorsk especially, these ports are not operating because they are blocked by the Russian fleet in front of the ports. So if we then assume that this situation is going to continue at least for say another half a year, then what we see is two elements. We see obviously that the 2021 crop cannot be unwound as usual, and Ukraine at the moment has got, we believe about, and the Ministry of Agriculture here believes, around 15 million tons just of exportable maize still inside the country. How much of that will actually be sellable and is still in elevators that are operational? Equally, we do not know, but it's a pretty massive number. But it will also impact the 2022 exports. And as a company, we are obviously looking into alternative routes. And what we have is, if you take the railroad connections into 4 countries that are of interest, which is Poland and Romania, in first instance, because they would offer direct seaport access, with certain limitations in terms of the Polish Gdansk and Gdynia ports, because they do not allow the berth depth that you need for Panamax class ships. You can only go in part loading and reload offshore or Handymax size, so that's a limitation. The other one is Constanza, who can load Panamax but has got limitations. If we then take export routes into Slovakia and Hungary, just to complete the picture, currently, just the railroads, and I'm not talking about the European port limitations, the railroads currently, without any further optimization work, without serious effort being put into this, would be able to export around 8 to 9 million tons. We have assumed in our calculations that this can be cranked up to 15 million tons of export through the railroads into the European Union. And keeping in mind that we have assumed and simply mathematically calculated an exportable volume out of 2022 crop of about 24 million US tons, we might see, depending when the ports will be open again, between 9 and 10 million tons of crop that will be stuck inside the country. What we believe also is that obviously this will impact not the Western Ukrainian producers. This will most likely impact the Central European, I say that again, Central Ukrainian producers and the Eastern and Southern Ukrainian producers, for one simple reason. If you take the difference from our headquarters in Ternopil, where a lot of our elevator capacity sits around this area, it's 206 kilometers to the Polish border, the border crossing that we would use for rail cars. If we are talking about a Central Ukrainian location, Cherkasy, it's already 786 kilometers, which means a difference of about $30 per ton. If we then draw this on to Eastern Ukrainian originations, anticipating that they actually will be fully functional after Russian troops leaving, that would increase to about $50 per ton. So it's quite likely, if the ports do not open, that we will see a serious bottleneck of Ukrainian export that are not automatically driven by Ukraine's ability to produce, but by Ukraine's ability to export. We do see quite a varying picture inside the readiness of various businesses to produce, and I have simplified this in the presentation in the 3 regions. We also have got huge variation inside the region. I think from a Ukrainian perspective, we can only say, thanks God, we've had Corona and the subsequent supply chain disruptions, because if I look not only at our business, but a lot of other businesses around us, we have been as aggressive as we've never been before with forward buying inputs. So actually the largest worry is less for West and Central Ukraine about availability of seeds, chemicals and fertilizers. These are largely, not fully, but largely on farm. Fuel will be a question. Who cannot store and hasn't got stocks right now, most likely in Central and Eastern Ukraine, will suffer. And I'm interested to hear also Professor Barman's view, who's involved in a business that is heavily impacted and much more impacted compared to us. But generally speaking, the spring season was relatively well prepared in Ukraine. What we will see, and this is now if we jump to the next slide, please, is the question: how is this going to either evolve or unwind? If we anticipate a significant reduction of 2022 crop, which will also be questionable in terms of fully being exported or with severe delays, with higher costs, and with a varying impact increasing from west to east, plus a combination with clearly we already see right now financing costs increasing, potential defaults of agricultural businesses. We've already seen that technical defaults so far, but these numbers will increase. We believe that there is a huge question to be asked: how the future of Ukrainian agriculture beyond 2022 crop is going to look. And there is, and that's I think my closing comment, a very high likelihood of long-term negative impact that might be more severe than what we assume right now for the 2022 crop, if ports do not open again, if businesses do not stabilize their cash flows, if the input security, and we've touched on this already in the presentation of Mr. Glauber, the dependency on fertilizers from Belarus and Russia will be a huge question, especially on the P&K, that will have to be answered for Ukraine for the future. if we take the combination of these factors, any day that this conflict prolongs puts a higher probability on an impact on the 2023 crop that might exceed what we are forecasting or assuming for the 2022 crop right now. So I think that's the summary and the closing words from my side.
Thank you very, very much, Georg. That's a fantastic presentation. It's, you know, in economics, people talk a lot about the death of distance and so on. We discuss a lot of markets where, you know, in services and so on, where distance and geography doesn't matter, but here it does so much. And especially this differentiated picture of Ukraine, that it's, Ukraine is not a point on the map. It's got geographic extent, different regions are affected in different ways. If I could just pick one question quickly before we go to our next speaker. Out of the chat, someone asked about weather conditions and what the outlooks are right now in Ukraine for the winter crops and for seeding in areas at least where things can be done. Could you maybe share something very quickly on that?
If we look at the west and central Ukraine, overwintering status of the crop is fine. I would say probably in line with 2021, which was not a bad year. On average, we've seen so far a cool spring. We haven't got immense water reserves, but so far the weather pattern that we've seen evolving was very similar to 2021, with a relatively cool spring start, but an early spring start. Occasional showers. We've just had on our operation between 8 and 30 millimeters of rain, which has washed in the first rates of or the first nitrogen into all the winter crops very nicely. Planting conditions are good. We are well ahead in our business as the most part of west of Ukraine and also central Ukraine in the planting program, because we've seen an earlier spring. If inputs are available, fuel is available in these farming businesses, and we will see a repetition of a 2021 weather pattern that will basically not be driving towards an extremely hot spring and continuous rainfalls in the area. Then I think the prospects principally for the Ukrainian crops are not significantly worse than for the 2021 crop. I mean, we all know it's central European conditions, it's continental climate. There's still a lot that can happen through the season, and we've seen crops completely deteriorating 6-8 weeks away from harvest. I've been through that, so I'm getting very nervous and cautious about forecasts at this moment of the year.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Let's move on to our last speaker, last presenter today. Roman Naita is a researcher at IAMO who's been engaged for several years in research and consulting in the field of agricultural and land policy, including the EU and the World Bank program entitled Supporting Transparent Land Governance in Ukraine. He's also involved in a project, I'm not sure if I'm going to say the name right, UA Food Trade, about sustainable internationalization of scientific structures in Ukraine, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Science. And Roman's presentation is entitled Sanctions and Russian Agriculture, What Happened and What Could Happen Next. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Let me share my presentation with you. Yeah, so nowadays we, I hope you can hear me, right? Yeah. Nowadays we are discussing a lot about the consequences of Russian war on global, yeah, I'm sorry, I have some technical difficulties. We are seeing a lot of discussion on the global food chain, on the global supply chain. Today, I'd like you to walk through the behind the scenes of Russian agriculture and try to give you a perspective of what's going on inside Russia, how high their dependence on foreign inputs are, and what they can do if each and every import to the Russia would be abandoned, strictly speaking. So thanks to Linda, we don't need to waste our time on the overview, and we can go straight into discussing some key agricultural inputs. So the key inputs are fuel, fertilizer, seeds, machinery, crop production products. And on top of that, one of the key inputs is financial resources, because quite frankly, you need some finances and typically some credit funds to fund your sowing campaign, for example. And on top of that, we also have traders and logistics, because as it was already mentioned today, it's not enough to produce the wheat, corn, barley, or whatever. So you also have to export it. The only topic we will not cover today is logistics. Everything else I'll try to be as brief as possible, but still say a couple of words about it. In terms of fuel and fertilizers, Russia is a key exporter of these commodities and doesn't rely on imports. And in terms of fertilizers, it's one of the largest exporters of fertilizers in the world. It exported like 7.6 billion US dollars worth of fertilizers to the whole world, and imported only like 100 and something millions dollars of fertilizers, and primarily from its allies, from Belarus and from Kazakhstan. So these two positions is not a big deal for Russians. In other sectors, it gets a little bit more complicated. So in terms of the financial resources, Russian farmers are not in the perfect spot to be in. Currently, a key interest rate set by the Russian central bank is like 20% or something. And it pretty much means that the cheap money is over for them, at least for now, at least for this sowing season. As far as I can understand it, as far as I can hear from the Russian farmers, from news reports, is that they have interest rates as high as 20-25%. There are some state-run subsidies aimed to decrease the interest rates for them, but the amount of money allocated to these subsidies is not enough, and many farmers are still struggling to get their their credits at the acceptable rate, and sometimes they are having troubles to get credits at all. Another problem is that Asian, primarily local farmers, require prepayments. At the same time, because of difficulties with borrowing, with having some cash on hand, quite often traders struggle to make a prepayment for local farmers, and it makes life a bit more difficult for them, but still it's manageable. Farmers also see the increase in the input prices. Is all over the world, so Russia is no exception in there. And also traders have some issues with dollar payments, and we are constantly hearing reports that Western banks are rejecting to work with their Russian counterparts. They're rejecting to work with Russian banks, even those which are not under the US or EU sanctions. So sometimes it can be a problem for them. In terms of the traders and in terms of trying to export your products out of Russia, share of multinational traders is Russian exports is as high as 30%. So it's not all that large, and some of them scaled down their operations. So we see that a bunch of suspended new export, but still keeps it planned. Cargo declares scaling down termination of new investments. Another two global traders suspended its operations in Russia, but there are some caveats. Louis Dreyfus has massive investments in the ports in the Azov Sea, and obviously he cannot operate this facility nowadays. So the suspension is more or less adequate to the conditions and not primarily due to the sanctions or something else. The Solaris Commodities suspended its operation as well, but some rumors says that it's primarily because of his close ties because of his partnership with local Russian firms, which is fully owned by the sanctioned VTB bank, Russian bank. So one of the most interesting examples is the trader ADM. He announced his intention to scale down his activities, but instead of doing so, he decided to erase this press release from his website. So that's that's what's going on with traders in Russia in terms of the presence of foreign traders there. But there is a key risk because some local traders are directly connected to the governments, to the Russian government or state-owned enterprise. So I already mentioned the large commodities who partnered with local firm who is owned by the VTB Bank. In recent years, reporters say that there are some new players on the market. They rapidly grow. They have rapidly growing market share, and as these new players are funded by the Russian either government or through state-owned enterprises, like already mentioned the VTB Bank. So it may impose a risk if any new sanctions will be imposed. In terms of the seed production, it depends on the exact culture we are talking about. So in terms of the wheat production, 97% of wheat seeds are domestically developed and produced, and pretty much it's the only culture which does not rely on foreign seeds. But even though these seeds are produced locally, 2/3 of the seed factories, I'm talking not only about the wheat producing facilities, the seeds for wheat, but also for all seed factories in Russia, 2/3 of them are based on the foreign equipment, and typically is one of the two companies, Petkus or Kimbia. It also imposes some significant risks to Russian agricultural production, not for this year's harvest, but for the upcoming. In terms of some other cultures, on the corn seed market, the largest 5 foreign companies account for 45% of all market. In terms of the sunflower, 5 largest foreign companies account for 63% of sunflower seeds market in Russia. So the dependence is rather high, and in case they would terminate their production, they would terminate the import of seeds, it would be quite difficult for Russia to replace these supplies. And the most interesting case is seeds for sugar beet production, because top 5 foreign players control more than 90% of the market, and Russian domestic production of sugar beet seeds accounts for only 3% of all. So in area, and the sugar market in Russia is quite a special case, and I will discuss it a little bit later. You can see a list of major companies, players in each of these niches, but so far none of them really left the Russian market. So each of them are more or less operational, and each of them continue to produce, sell, import their products to Russia. In terms of the crop production products, we have quite an equal split between local and foreign players, and it used to be, this market used to be more or less dominated by the foreign companies, but in recent years, Russia had been able to boost up their own production. But in terms of the crop protection products produced by the foreign companies, 2/3 of them are imported, and 1/3 of them are produced domestically on their plants in Russia. So even if imports would be somehow disrupted from European countries, for example, they would still more or less make it. The biggest players are Syngenta, BASF, Bayer, and Corteva, but one of the main interesting points in this market is that 90% or even more of all active substances for crop protection products is supplied from China. So there's quite a big chance that even if these companies, I think Syngenta, BASF, Bayer, would withdraw from the Russian market, their market share could be relatively easily consumed by the local players. So, but so far, none of these companies terminated their activities on the Russian market. So they have not all that much to worry about in this department. In terms of the agricultural machinery, another key input is that Russia is heavily importing agricultural machinery. The first line is about the tractor inputs. We can see that the biggest share is that the top 1 importer of tractors to Russia is Belarus. It's the closest Russian ally. as close as it gets nowadays. But the next four the next four importers are European countries. We are talking about Netherlands, Germany, Poland, France. And what we really see is that the import of machinery from the EU cannot be substituted by Russian own production or by import from Belarus, from Kazakhstan, from any of its allies, because while the average price of Russian tractor or Belarus tractor is around 10 grand, the average price of an imported European country, depending on tractor, depending on the country, is ranging from $65,000 to $77,000. So these are not close substitutes. And as far as we can understand, is that most of the large agri-housing of large players in the Russian market, they solely rely on the imported machinery, while cheaper tractors are mainly for smaller players, maybe for some self-subsistent farmers or for farmers who operate a relatively small amount of land. So for other types of machinery for soil cultivation, we have quite the same picture. We have a substantial share of import from developed nations, from Western nations, and this import cannot be easily substituted as well. There's massive price difference between average price of cultivated imported from China or Belarus and cultivated exported from Germany or the United States, for example. So the key players on this market in Russia, many of them have production facilities in Russia, as for example, CNH, John Deere, and so far we are seeing some signs of temporary suspension of the activities, is the suspension of the imports. The CNH suspended, as far as we understand, the operation of its farm or of its plant in Russia. John Deere keeps its plant operational, but till he stops imports to the country. But for other players, such as Claas, for Horsch, Krohn, Kuhn, there's no reliable information available, and to the best of our knowledge, they're continuing doing business as usual. So far we mainly talked about the crop production. I'd also like to mention a couple of bullet points about the livestock production. Livestock production in Russia is heavily dependent on the imported reproductive materials and equipment, machinery. In terms of the dairy farming, the exact number is still estimated, but the majority of the heifers for the milk cow herds are imported from the Western nations. Approximately 70% of hatching eggs and 99% of hybrids are imported as well in the Russian poultry industry. And they have quite a large share of foreign companies on the equipment market. In terms of the dairy farms equipment market, 2/3 of this market is taken by two large firms, DeLaval and Westphalia Surge. In terms of the equipment for poultry and hog farming, it's almost a monopoly of the German company, Big Dutchman. So they're quite reliant on the Western inputs. And I also want to touch one time this special case of sugar, because it's quite a key. That's, first of all, it's a product that doesn't affect directly the food security and the food security issues, but it's still quite an important product for the food industry in Russia. It's important for food, for country production. It is important for fruit preservation. It's important to make alcohol. It's important to make vodka. And the last 2 years, the harvest of sugar beets is below the level required for self-sufficiency. And Russia risks to see severe shortages of sugars. If you follow the Russian news, you may see some fights in the store for sugars, but it could be on another level. So, so far, Russia is trying to stimulate the import of sugar. They impose 300,000 tons duty-free, tariff-free quota for import of sugar, but some traders divert sugar shipments from Russia to other countries, even despite that. We've seen two cases of such an examples already, and we see that on the local market, the price of sugar soared for almost 50%. At the same time, they are heavily dependent on foreign inputs. Almost all of the seeds for sugar beets in Russia are imported. So let's make a couple of quick conclusions. In terms of fuels and fertilizers, Russia is a key exporter and has nothing to worry about it. In terms of seed, machinery, equipment, crop protection products, there's a substantial dependence on the imported inputs. For some cases, this dependence is slightly smaller. For another products or cultures, it's larger, but nonetheless, in terms of financial resources, they experience some difficulties, but so far these difficulties are manageable. In terms of traders, it's kind of the mixed bag. So far, the situation is under control, but there are some serious risks because of some crucial players to be directly or indirectly controlled by Russian state-owned companies. That's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you very much, Roman. That was very interesting. And I think one of the things you did was you at least reassured a little bit that in the short run, there's probably not going to be any major impacts on production. But in the medium term, in terms of some of the key inputs like machinery and spare parts, there might be indeed. And with that, you also answered one of the questions that's in the chat that was asked by Oleg Nevetsky, who was specifically asking about some of the harvest outlooks for Russia in the coming year. So thank you very much for that. We're short on time, and I hope that we can maybe go over time a little bit at least to look at some of the questions that have come up in the chat. I hope that some of the panelists can stay on a little bit longer for some of that, but of course, maybe some of you will have to drop out at some point. In case somebody does have to drop out, thank you very, very much to all of the panelists and to the organizers once more for being on hand today and for contributing. It's been a very, very interesting set of presentations so far. There's a number of questions in the chat, and one of them that I'm not sure that we really want to get into because it's a controversial topic is the whole topic about implications for EU policy. There's one question from Hans-Georg Stark, whether the current food security crisis as a result of the invasion of Ukraine justifies a rollback of, for example, some of the Green Deal measures that have been proposed. Maybe the panelists, some of them will feel a need to say something about that. One other thing I wanted to throw out, it's related to questions that I've heard, but it wasn't explicitly asked in the chat. You know, I heard a report yesterday that India is exporting wheat to Russia. India hasn't really been a major exporter in the past. And I heard one internal report this year that some companies are expecting that India might export as much as 9.5 million tons, up from 3 last year. So what about countries such as India? And I'm thinking, of course, especially of China, which is sitting on huge reserves, and whether we might see not a supply response in terms of production, but we might see a bit of a readjustment of stock levels. Joe, I see your hand is up on that. Would you like to share something on that?
Yeah, no, certainly these high prices are going to bring wheat out from a lot of different corners of the world, I think. And remember, India is interesting. If only, as you say, people are talking between 7 and 10 million tons potential exports from India this year. Remember that India was one of the countries that put on export bans in 2007-8 and 2010-11, both on rice and wheat. So this would be a departure and a very welcome one, I think, in the sense of supplying wheat, to the rest of the world. There have been some talk about Brazil actually exporting a little more wheat this year. Now, Brazil is actually a large net importer of wheat. So obviously, in terms of looking at overall balances, one's going to be wanting to see what that impact on net is on the world. But again, I think that those sorts of things will happen. China is very interesting. China has typically, when me and other analysts look at global wheat reserves, we tend to exclude China because those reserves don't normally make it onto world markets. We don't know even how great they are. I mean, we have estimates. USDA puts out estimates. U.S. Department of Agriculture, FAO. We have a number of estimates. They're all large, but the quality of the wheat is very much in doubt. And so I think that the idea that good milling quality wheat would be making it out to the rest of the world, I think is probably unlikely. Also, the size of the current crop is, of course, unknown. It's coming out of dormancy. There is some dryness in the major wheat areas right near Beijing, so that's going to be closely watched. And they've already imported 2 million tons this calendar year. We haven't seen the numbers yet for March, but at least January through February, they've imported 2 million tons. So and last year they imported about 10, just to give you some context, which was a big year as far as imports are concerned. So I think China is less, I think it's safe to sort of exclude those stocks, not saying that they wouldn't. We saw them export rice, for example, in the early 2000s out of reserves, but typically those stocks, if anything, they tend to, they imported a lot of wheat last year for feed purposes. And so whether or not they'll continue that, I think is anyone's guess. But you're right. I think insofar as the rest of the world is concerned, I think we will see everyone trying to get a little bit, take advantage of really high prices and be trying to export as much as they can. But it's a huge gap to make up. And I see this high prices, even I think the speakers on Ukraine were even more forceful on this in terms of how well we're just not going to see much out of Ukraine this year, I don't think. And I think this gap is going to take 18 months at least to sort of, not until we see those fall planted crops be put in the ground this winter, I think we begin to get some notion of how much supplies we'll see in 2023, and hopefully prices start moderating a bit then.
Thank you very much. I just see in the chat, we are reminded that on April 13th, there's going to be another webinar that deals with agriculture policy implications. So I'll leave that be for the moment, and we won't get into the very controversial question of whether the European Union should continue with the farm to fork strategy and so on, which is attracting a lot of attention in our media here in Europe, certainly. Alexander Prishkopov asked one question about the specter of Russia, depending on how the military campaign controls, gaining territory and gaining control over an even larger share of the Black Earth region, the Black Soil region, and what that means for the future. And we had two presentations from a Russian perspective. I was just wondering if maybe Linda or Roman would like to share something on that. Grain is a bit different than oil. Oil or gas, you can sort of just close the spigot and wait a little bit. But in the farm area, of course, the Russian regime, Putin and so on, has farmers who want to produce and who have to earn money, in a large portion of the population that is dependent. So to what extent can he really use grain in this way? And especially if he gets control of even more territory in the long run as a weapon. There's been this talk about a grain OPEC in the past coming from Russian circles. Do we really have to worry about that?
Well, I believe if Linda remains quiet, I'd like to answer a little bit. So far, what do we know is that Russia already has a market power on the wheat market. I believe in Yamal there were like 6 or 7 doctoral theses on this issue, and in the middle run, I don't think that even if Russia would be able to capture any substantial amount of Ukrainian soil, they would be able to make something out of it in this season or in the next season, because so far, according to my data, approximately 82.5 thousand kilometers of soils in Ukraine are mined. So it's not safe to produce anything on these territories. I may be wrong, but it may take a year, maybe a couple of years to demine this area. So in the short run, nothing gonna happen, I believe. And what we are seeing now, we have reports of Russians stealing our machinery, stealing our equipment. We have some horrendous examples of GPS trackers of our Ukrainian John Deeres popping up in Chechnya or somewhere else. So I don't think they would try to use Ukrainian territory to produce a harvest. But I would like to talk for one more minute about the important question you said, you asked pretty much, is that we have a lot of recommendations to exclude Russian agricultural sector from sanctions. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about I'm not supporting a full ban on Ukrainian agricultural export, but just a few very important things to keep in mind. First one being that right now, exporting any goods from Russia has negative externalities, and primarily I'm talking about killed, raped, and executed Ukrainians. For me, it's quite an externality. I'm sorry for that. And at the end of the day, even in terms of agriculture exports, Russia has export tariff, and on wheat export alone, Russia is projected to make like almost $400 million in the next couple of months on wheat export alone in budget revenue. Second, what I believe that what Russia does, not only on Ukrainian soil, but in the whole world, is terrorism. They are making threats of famine in multiple countries. For some countries, it would be just a higher food price, a higher bill, but for many others, as Joseph already pointed out, in, for example, Yemen, it would be a disaster, it would be a catastrophe. If we allow Russia to increase their share of global market, of global agricultural market, they will use it as a weapon of terror, as they already did with gas, with oil. That's quite an important externality, and that's something to keep in mind. We already have this story in other sectors. The disastrous effect will be even more severe. And only one sentence, when we have an externality in economics, we are trying to handle it. We are trying to impose some tariff or something like that. We are not trying to support these externalities. We are not trying to give more weapons to the terrorists.
Linda, would you like to add anything to that, please?
Yeah. Maybe I can also come or refer to the question by Rico Ile, if Russia is in the long term a reliable food supplier. So I think these are really tough questions, and I think maybe we should broaden the perspective. So the corona crisis as well as the war have shown or made us aware that resilience is an issue we did not yet take sufficiently into account. And I think the global trade system offers excellent opportunities to care or to install resilience, food system resilience. And now we should see how we do it. And once again, it can be a pandemic, it can be a war, it can be serious harvest shortfalls, which we highly probably will see in the future due to climate change. And I think all these events could be better tackled if we diversify trade. And so I would see it from that perspective, because we cannot yet say that Russia weaponized its dominant position. But it's not, if so many people are depending on Russia's grain supply, is of course highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I know from many discussions I've had, including with some policymakers in Brussels and so on, it's a real sort of moral dilemma at the moment. I mean, on the one hand, we definitely need every bit of grain we can get from anywhere, but on the other hand, we want to apply sanctions to Russia. And how do we deal with this exactly? There's no easy solution, unfortunately, at least now in the very short run, you know, how to deal with that. Joe, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, there's gradations too. I mean, I think food is a lot easier to sort of, people say, okay, yeah, they get that. I think inputs to me are equally critical, yet that, you know, I think that's a tougher sell to some people, saying, but it's, if you look at the high dependence, and I realize exactly those points, that just means more revenue for a regime that right now is, you know, people are seeking to say, no, you know, we want this to come at a very high cost, so you reconsider what you're doing. And so these are very tough questions, I think.
Mm-hmm. With a view to the clock, I think we really should wrap up, but I'd like to ask maybe Georg von Nolken, as someone who's involved on the ground in Ukraine. Would you like to wrap up for us a little bit, perhaps, at least from your perspective? Production, can we be at least guardedly optimistic about Ukraine's ability to produce and recovery from this situation, assuming that the military situation can be solved fairly soon? You've been in the country for a few years now. You see the responses that are happening right now as we watch how resilient the population really does seem to be. Or do you really worry that we're going to see a pretty serious dip in production, even beyond a conclusion to the military situation for a few years to come?
I think I agree with the point that was made previously, that we've got mined areas, we've got large destruction of agricultural machinery, we've got targeted destruction of agricultural machinery in occupied territories. So all these elements will clearly provide a setback. But there's a couple of things that I believe count the opposite way. It is the resilience in the country itself that you see, and a clear understanding that basically it's two economical sectors that support Ukraine. If we take the heavy industries out, it's IT, it's agriculture. That's the two industries that support the country, that create foreign currency coming in, and that is clearly understood by the population, and it's clearly understood by the government. There's an unbelievable push inside Ukraine and support by all administrations and authorities to support agriculture in these times, to get seeded, to get harvested, and I think I am actually less worried about setting up agriculture production in the areas again that have suffered so much because of the resilience that and the ability to react to various situations that I have seen in Ukraine over the last 4 years. The will to get together and fix situations very quickly, and I think it's fairly unique if you look at Central European conditions. I have worked in countries around Ukraine, and I've worked inside Ukraine, so I think I can mentality-wise draw the comparison. That's one element. The drop in production and the key questions, I think, remain quite clearly threefold. It's when is the export through the ports going to resume? Because unfortunately, I am pessimistic about the export to Europe to be able to cover not the 20 million tons, out of 2022 at some point, but they are never going to cover 60, 70, 80 million tons as goes through the Black Sea ports. So if Ukraine is taking off Black Sea access, this is going to mean a serious setback for 3, 4, 5 years till some other ways are built, found. And it's not just about railroad cars, it's about railroad tracks, it's about ports, etc. So it's not a quick fix. So export logistics are one element. Subsequently, the question of cash flow in the agricultural businesses and cash flow support will be a question. If Ukraine has got setbacks on exports, if the timings of exports are broken up, then businesses will run into cash flow problems. And I'm not specifically referring to the big holdings. I'm also referring to a lot of local farmers, and we must not forget that a lot of the country is actually farmed by family businesses, not by the 10 big names that you might connect to Ukraine in your mind. Last but not least, and that remains the last question, which I believe needs working on internationally. It's the questions: where are the nutrients that are going to feed the Ukrainian crops going to come from in the future? If the phosphate and the potash do not come out of Belarus and Russia, where are they going to come from? If we are, and this is where the political discussion around gas and energy also kicks in. If we are limiting gas from Russia, which wearing a Ukrainian hat, I've got a clear view on. If I wear an agriculture hat and a European hat, then the question is who's going to produce the nitrogen fertilizers that we need to, and from which energy source to produce the nitrogen. And not only Ukraine, but actually the geographical Europe will need to support global food supplies. So that's I think three elements that I see that need resolving. I am less doubtful about the Ukrainian ability to deal with the situation inside the country, because there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of will, and there's an unbelievable amount of resilience in this country to fix these items. But the three key questions remain: ports, financing, fertilizers.
Thank you very, very much. That's great. I'm looking towards the program directors here, Taras and Alfons. You maybe like to finish up with a few words, and I would leave it at this point. Thank you very, very much to all four of my panelists. It was really great. It was a pleasure. I learned a lot, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone who was in attendance today on that. Thanks to the organizers, and over to you.
Yeah, also from my side, many, many thanks to all the participants, to the presenters, and also special thanks to Stefan for the moderation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you are prepared or interested to join also the next webinar on April 13th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.